One day we're going to have that. All right. So let's get started here. I was hoping to actually get past it, but I'm sure I won't because there's a lot of stuff when we start to talk about the rest of endocrine, and then we'll in the lab perspective. I suspect we're going to be doing both heart and blood. I don't know which one is going to come first. Uh, we'll just have to see how we progress because I'll get some of the blood stuff out of the way in lecture for Friday and then maybe Monday. I'll see. Maybe we can get the blood lab put together. We'll just have to see. All right. Nevertheless, here we go. Okay, so here I am. So we finished part A, which is really sort of the basics around it. And now we get more into sir. I don't know. 3, 9, and 11.
Did you just say you don't know?
I don't know. 3, 9, because I didn't recall off the top of my head. Usually my default answer is I don't know.
You're valid though. Like I don't either.
I
respect it.
This isn't on it.
This is not on. Not 3, 9, and 11. We ended the nervous system. We ended neurotransmitters. Adios.
Oh, that's easy.
Yeah.
It's money in the bank.
Job done. Yes. Let's move on. Where are people? I'm missing people. Oh, I know. Yeah, she needs like a week to rest.
She needs a year of
You
rest.
should get like IV set up in here for us. They keep us hydrated and healthy.
You don't need to be. You're hydrating a little too much with the wrong stuff.
Hey, we drink coffee. I had a banana this morning.
I did.
Oh, on the weekends. I haven't drank since that time.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What? That's a legit.
Horse it. Pardon me.
Legit. I haven't drank
Horse
since
it.
that.
Pardon me. All right. Enough of this tomfoolery or full tomery. Where will the students sleep? They'll sleep where they've always slept, in class. That is a line from a movie from 1932 called Horse Feathers. 1932, Horse Feathers, the Marx Brothers. Thank you very much. One day, go look at it. Some of the stuff is hysterical. Okay, so let us look now in these. We should be getting, we did the pituitary, so the next thing should be, I don't know why I didn't pick it up right away. Let me make sure. Everybody just let me make real quickly make sure that I didn't skip anything from part A, and I probably shouldn't. Yeah, we ended up doing just looking at all the pituitary hormones. I don't know why the introduction to part B didn't proceed the way it was supposed to. Maybe I missed it. So this is the thyroid, and the thyroid we underrate the thyroid because it effectively, and I've talked about it already, governs. Our body is governed in the sense that it doesn't do things too rapidly or too slowly, depending on the circumstance. When it used to do them rapidly, it does. Slowly when it does. The organ that maintains that rate of metabolism, if you will, is the thyroid. So it's the metabolic control. And I mean, normally it should be like when you start your car, if it just starts and hums, that's what your thyroid should be doing. If it's sitting there going like that, it's hypothyroid. And if it just goes crazy like a hot rod, like somebody with a competition car, then that's hyperthyroid. If you want to think of it that way, and that kind of works for me. So we have it both anatomically. It's maybe a little bigger than you think. It's really on either side with a connector that goes across your Adam's apple. That's the median mass or isthmus. The major structures in there are the follicular cells. They make the part that we're interested in more than anything else right now, thyroglobule. I mean, it's not the only thing that it makes, but you'll see that the thyroglobulin is the principal thing. And what's so interesting about it is it's effectively they're secreting a colloid. So what's a colloid? Protein and water-based materials together that form within the lumen, within the hollow area. And it's a typical glandular tissue, as you'll see, with the cells on the periphery and it typically stains pink. This liquid material, colloidal material in the center. That's where it stays until it undergoes final processing, which we'll look at physiologically, and that requires the key ingredient, iodine. And without the iodine, all that it's just going to keep accumulating fluid, and therein is the problem. It's more than a trace element, iodine, but it's not certainly not a major element. It's somewhere in between. We probably categorize as a minor element. And for those of you who had the bone unit with me, you'll remember parafollicular cells, which are alongside, as the name would suggest, of the follicle cells that make that interesting hormone that plays probably a more important role in growing bone in children and less so in adults, called calcitonin. Its action is to put calcium into bone rather than the opposite when we get to parathyroid hormone right after this, which leaches or pulls out by a variety of measures calcium out of bone and brings calcium into the bloodstream from other sources. So here's a location. The first thing to note is the abundance of blood vessels. And I probably told you this before. Thyroids, you remove thyroids a fair amount because it's a gland that forms a fair amount of tumors. It's a very easy cancer to deal with comparatively because we have thyroid supplement. The problem is the blood supply. And I can recall at least 2 or 3 occasions doing thyroidectomies where I was scrubbed in. I wasn't doing the procedure, I was holding retractors. And this immense amount of blood vessels that were clamping and tying and clamping and tying. And literally, when they pulled the thyroid out, you must have had 50 clamps, which are little hemostats, we were called mosquito hemostats, attached to it. And the very first, and we're writing the post-op orders, the very first order that you write is have a tracheostomy tray available at bedside for the patient. Because if it bleeds, they're not going to be able to breathe. You might have to trach them. The blood supply is immense. And then you have to be careful not to remove the parathyroids, which are on the sort of the under or the volar or the posterior aspect of it. So it's a highly, and that's classic endocrine. It just sends this thyroid hormone all over the place. Here's what here, the parafollicular cells are in this sort of the area, and the follicular cells, and that's classic glandular structure. When you typically something that's probably mostly a cuboidal cell, and what does it do? It secretes into this lumen and fills it with colloid. So we see 2 forms, okay? T4, the major form, which again, this is the symmetrical arrangement of tyrosine molecules with 4 bound iodines, and T3, which only has 3 of them, but the tissue level effectively they become all 4. So both are iodine containing amine-based hormones because they're made from tyrosine, okay? Cell in the body binds to intracellular receptors. The symmetry and the relatively small size facilitated crossing the membrane just like any fat soluble column. So it is not a G protein based. And yes, and the whole idea is it goes intracellular receptors into the nuclear area, transcription, then translation. Variety of rates. They call it calorogenic effects because it increases basic metabolic rate and heat production. Okay. Regulates tissue and growth development. So it's all part of all of the other things that are going on as long as the thyroid is functioning at the appropriate level. Normal skeleton, nervous system, reproduction, blood pressure, if necessary, increasing adrenergic receptors, which we already talked about, in the autonomic nervous system and blood vessel. The thyroid gland stores the hormone outside of the cells in that lumen until thyroid stimulating hormone basically, and that storage is basically triggered by this thyroid stimulating hormone, and then the need to release it. That's where the iodine come in. So synthesized and discharged, iodine is trapped, and it's the iodide ion particularly, taken into the cell actively, okay, and it's converted then to I2. And I'm not going to go through the chemical pathways, okay, and then you have mono and di, but really the forms that are critical, and you'll see the illustration that they show you T3 and T4 more than anything else. So the colloid is endocytosed, okay, and eventually the T3 and T4 are basically make their way into the bloodstream. Mostly T4, but some T3. T4, and this is where they had it misconnected. The T4 eventually at the tissue level, the most active form is T3. When we're dealing with people with thyroid abnormalities, that's what you monitor. You look at to see if they're hyper or U, which is normal thyroid or hypothyroid. You look at circulating T3 and T4 levels, and you look at TSH levels, thyroid stimulating hormones. That's your monitor for it. And because we do see a lot of people who have this problem, and it's not just people, animals have this problem a lot. So it's and if anything, and again, it's much more difficult to treat hyperthyroidism to slow it down than because thyroid supplement has been around for a very, very long time. That's the advantage of why there's nearly 100%, and we rarely use the words these days, cure rate for thyroid cancer. I mean, it's one of those ones, if they said you had to have one, that would be one you want to pick out of the box, so to speak. And they show you this, and you can see the illustration that's here. So the iodine is trapped, actively transported in, oxidized into actual iodine. So it goes from iodide back to iodine, forming these sort of, let's call them precursor forms, mono and di. Iodinated tyrosines are then linked together, whether it's two dyes or a dye and a mono, to form respectively the T4 and T3. Then they're enveloped, as typically things are, for vesicular transport, and transported and released or exocytosed in their mature forms into the bloodstream. That's the whole idea that's there. T4 and T3 are transported because, again, they're fat soluble by certain globulins. We'll explore those when we look at the blood. There's different categories of globulin hormones. These binding globulins are different than the ones we spend most of the time discussing, which are in the gamma globulin category, which are function more as antibodies. So you're going to see alpha and beta and gamma globulins that we will have some discussion about. T3 is 10 times more active. Tissues have an enzyme that's able to convert it. The enzyme removes clearly one of the iodines. So, classic arc. Falling levels of thyroid hormone, T3 or T4, stimulate the release of the TSH. Rising TH, negative feedback inhibition on TSH can also be inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, dopamine, increased levels of cortisols and iodide. So there's quite an elaborate set of controls that are there. As you can see, during pregnancy or exposure to cold, particularly so in infants, because remember, it's calorogenic effect. It's going to increase the internal heat that the hypothalamus can generate under those, let's call them extreme circumstances, thyrotropin releasing hormone, the TRH. And you see the classic arcs there, kind of saw it before. So you can see the effect they have on both of those structures. The big deal is the iodine. The iodine doesn't really participate in that arc, other than in the absence of iodine, you cannot generate T3 and T4. So the globulin accumulates in the thyroid gland and it enlarges. It's not a tumor. It has a totally different word. It's called a goiter. Okay. Historically, and we used to see people with goiters all the time until we began to put iodine in our diet, and obviously that's where you get iodized salt. And so a certain amount, most of the salt, if you typically go and get a thing of salt, unless you're getting a fancy cooking salt that you happen to prefer, okay? So you're going to get that thing of Morton salt, okay? It's going to say iodized salt. It's about 80% sodium chloride and about 20% potassium iodide. You don't need a whole lot. You need just a pinch, comparatively speaking. So most of the prepared foods you have, they're going to buy the least expensive form of salt possible. They're not getting the Himalayan pink salt or the gray salt or the Mediterranean sea salt to put in a can of green beans when you're making green bean casserole. Food moment for green bean casserole. I make my own. Nice bechamel, some mushrooms. You can't beat those canned fried onion rings. Oh, happy days.
What's your favorite casserole then? Green bean?
Oh, no, well, yeah, holiday wise, green bean. I mean, I actually like broccoli cheese casseroles. And I saw a great recipe for that. Jamie Oliver, the Naked Chef, just did one of the show on one of the channels I watch that I stream for like a Brussels sprout casserole. Oh my god, I was in tears. We got my daughter was dating a guy who was. I think I've told you she had a predilection at that time for dating. Don't you even look at me like that, young lady.
Oh no, I heard about it from the Asian
I know. Just, you want me to get the website for you?
people. Some say. Maybe over there.
Sorry, I'm just joking. I know. And the guy, and she's so friendly with it. And he said, great guy. We went to Off the Hook up in Cranberry, which is great and expensive. And they had a Brussels sprout, like a casserole we got. That was the best thing on the menu. I mean, they got Wagyu beef sliders and stuff like. I mean, you know, she's drinking out of a $200 bottle of wine. I wouldn't know the difference. It's just, if I had all that money, I'd just spend it. It'd be too much fun. Notice the things that are there: basic metabolic rate. All of these promoting glucose catabolism, mobilizing fats, protein synthesis, normal development, normal functioning of the heart, normal muscular function, normal growth and maturation of the skeleton, normal GI motility, normal. That's thyroid 101. If it's working properly, you're good. We do see this. This is a very interesting. Edema is an accumulation of fluid that occurs because it's that thing of it extruding out of the blood vessels and accumulating based on gravity. Okay, but mixed edema is something that we do see in sort of classic of hypothyroidism. Low metabolic rate. We typically see folks with thick skin and dry skin, puffy eyes, always cold. The digestive function is impaired or slowed down, constipation, mental sluggishness, lethargy. Okay, that's so those are little tells. For those of you, if you go into clinical fields and you're looking at somebody who has that, it's kind of like in the back of your mind, you know, bells and whistles go off. That's what a diagnostician does. They see these little things. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and finally you get a piece that makes it work. If it's due to lack of iodine, then you see the classic goiter because it interrupts basically the negative feedback cycle functions, but it's constantly releasing that thyroid stimulating hormone, making more globulin, but it's not usable thyroid globulin. So all the critical things that are there, we do see it. Poor development congenitally. These are things, pituitary problems, maternal medications, sometimes rarely. Certain things that you might look for. I don't know enough about that. And so typically what happens once it's identified, we have the luxury of thyroid supplementation. When it's hyperthyroid, it's a little more difficult. Okay. If that makes any sense, it's a little more difficult because those medications have more side effects. So they're showing you a goiter that's there, and those clear up remarkably quickly with trace amounts of iodine. This is an interesting disease, and I always like the disease because of the name. Because my wife's last name is Graves. She uses her, you know, we didn't change her name. I remember my sister asking me when we got married, is there going to be a name change? I said, no, I'm going to leave it at Stein. And my sister's like, very traditional, you know. Yeah, but by the time you get married when you're 60 years old, by that time, all of, your bank account, your credit, why change the name? It's confusing. So her last name is Graves. It's an autoimmune disease. The body makes abnormal directed at the follicular cells. It mimics TSH. So it stimulates thyroid hormone, elevated metabolic rate, sweating, and this is the type of the things we see with hyperthyroidism. Sweating, rapid irregular heart rate, nervousness, weight loss, hypersecretors, they perspire a lot, digestive problem. And what happens is the eye, interestingly enough, having to do with the fluids in the eyes, they develop something called it's like a pop eye. So it's a protruding eye. It's called an exophthalmic goiter. And that's one of those little, when you don't see it that often. That would be the first thing that you would think of clinically. And they show you a picture of that. So treatments, surgical removal, radioactive iodine, etc. That's what I mean. But you can see these eyes that really protrude that are there that are part of it. So you see the calcitonin, again, it certainly is by definition an antagonist to what we're going to go over next. Parathyroid hormone, it higher than normal, I think, which we see more in children, it does inhibit osteoclastic activity. So it's going to stimulate the embedding or the absorption of calcium or calcium uptake into bone. So you're starting to see some high, I mean, again, one of those treatments that may or may not be relevant down the road for osteoporosis. I don't know that that's at that stage of the thing yet. Which brings us now to, again, the thyroid, non-essential, parathyroid, essential. Calcium is so important. We don't have the luxury or the means to deal with the critical hormone that's most critical for its availability, and that is by far and away this very tiny, and they're like distinctly differently colored than the thyroid, that are embedded on the back, typically 4, but as many as 8. Okay, they have something called an oxyphil cell, not relevant to us, but the parathyroid cells, and universally we use the PTH acronym for parathormone or parathyroid hormone. It is clearly the biggest player in calcium homeostasis. And remember, we did it in bone. There are 3 real ways that when we look at calcium, and 3 things that impact it. Okay, it's impacted at the kidney level by retaining calcium. We can pull it out of bone, which is really our bank for calcium. And lastly, from the gut. As we eat, we can have the means to absorb more calcium. In order to do that, we have to have vitamin D. And you're going to see that that's where parathyroid hormone, those are the 3 areas it works. One pulls it out of bone. It activates osteoclasts. The osteoclasts release enzymes from those. Remember those osteoclasts, they're in those banks of cells, those ruffled borders that are able to begin to break down. And they break down, it's not just calcium, they break down matrix, and they release the calcium phosphate into the bloodstream. That's how they increase it. It triggers the increased absorption of calcium at the gastrointestinal level, but only in the presence of adequate vitamin D. Back again to the importance of vitamin D and vitamin D's role with calcium. And then lastly, stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb calcium. So you can look at the target organs there on the bottom. So and it's a classic negative feedback pathway secreted in response to low blood levels of calcium, inhibited by rising levels of calcium. There they are on the back. The cellular structure is, you could look at, I don't make a lot out of it. Stimulates the osteoclast, enhances resorption of calcium and secretion of phosphate by the kidneys. So that's where for years, and I don't know if they still use it, they were using drugs to treat osteoporosis, and they were promoted quite a bit, but I don't think they were tolerated terribly well, that basically reversed that. What they did was they enhanced the reabsorption, but they basically retained phosphate. They were the phosphate drugs were a little bit different in the way I think those drugs really did more on the phosphate and on the calcium side of things. But I don't know if they were that. They were called diphosphonates or bisphosphonates, as I recall. I don't know if they're still being used as much. But promotes activation of vitamin D by kidneys, which leads to increased absorption of calcium. Vitamin D is interesting in sort of the pathway that it takes. Skin is important, and sunlight for activation of vitamin D. It has to go through the kidneys to be further activated. So those are all things we see associated with osteoporosis. Lack of sunlight, folks who have kidney function. Where do we get to diabetes? That's part of that. That's part of it, and there's more stuff that comes on with that as well. So voila, you can see all those types of things. hyperparathyroidism. Okay. And because of this role that we're just starting to see, the relationship of intra and extracellular calcium. When we're looking at the extracellular calcium levels, that's where we start to see things that affect nerves and affect the nervous system. And we'll see that again and again, particularly as we look at cardiovascular function. And yes, that also means the most common nidus, which means the core of a kidney stone, calcium. And so there's a, it's sort of, I think it's a two-edged sword. The area, when we get to kidney, you'll see that the area I'll comment on, so I'll say it now, that we're seeing it used to be, kidney stones were something we saw in men, mostly, 30s, 40s was typically about the time you started to see it. We're seeing, and women didn't get it until much later. Younger women are getting it because we're seeing an increased amount of calcium supplements being used early on to deal with, someone who has got the risk factors of osteoporosis. So that's kind of where I think that comes from a little bit. That's there. Myself. Okay. Severe, easily fractured bones potentially would be in there. And I remember attending a lecture. A friend of mine's dad was an endocrinologist at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And he would, every year in our residency program, he would come in and do a guest lecture on metabolic bone disorders, talking about the impact of parathyroidism being one of them. So, I mean, it's something that we did see a lot of. Again, we can deal with it a little bit. In this case, we can deal with having too much of it by supplementing the calcium and taking other steps as opposed to too little. When you have an excessive amount of calcium, muscle spasms, respiratory paralysis, and death. And that's the problem. If we lose that, when we don't have enough calcium, now we have big problems. Okay. So it brings us to the next significant one, and this is not the adrenal medulla, but to the adrenal cortex. It is comprised of 3 zones from outside to inside, or from peripheral to central, as you will see. They are all different they're all produce cholesterol-based hormones that we classify because they come from the adrenal cortex as corticosteroids. So they're steroidal based, they're rapidly able to cross membranes, they're extraordinarily potent, but they're different. Okay? And you're going to see that the forms that we deal with are aldosterone, which is probably produced in the greatest amount, something called cortisol, which is the active form, and then mysteriously androgens. And these are testosterone-like substances and precursors, which have an interesting role. And a lot of the illicit performance-enhancing drugs have been from that. I mean, and those precursors were available for the longest time. The most famous of those, if you're a baseball fan, and you guys don't believe it, but the biggest game in the world was baseball up until the onset of the NFL. I mean, it's the NFL. But the biggest sports were baseball, horse racing, and boxing back in the 50s and 60s. They just worked. You have to take my word for that. And so when the whole Mark McGuire and steroids things, what did they find in his locker? A precursor substance, androstenedione. And he was eating that, and it was there right in front for everybody to see. It's not a mystery. It's classically called andro. I don't know if it's still. I mean, you could buy that stuff at GNC.
What?
Androstenedione. You could. I mean, if you saw him when he was Rookie of the Year, and I'm going to tell you, I think it was 1988 or 87 for playing for the Oakland A's, and he hit like 50 homers. He was skinny, tall, 6'6", but relatively skinny.
Yeah.
And they had the Bash brothers. He can't
You
say
saying you had Barry Bonds glow up?
Oh yeah. He was huge to start. I mean, and then all of a sudden he goes from 6'6", 220 to 6'6", 270.
Yeah.
Hitting 70 home runs. Oh yeah. Fascinating stuff. So they're sometimes we call them suprarenal because they're above the kidney. Cortex and medulla, 3 layers of glandular, different hormones. We've already done the medulla. We're giving it. So the adrenal gland produces 24 different hormones collectively called corticosteroids. Okay, they're not stored. If they're made, they're released. The zones, in this order: glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. I don't think I was going to ask you that question. If I would, I remember if I ever asked it once, it was the glomerulosa. And when they call them mineralocorticoids, that's because they're impacting the critical mineral sodium. And the chemical that we'll look at several times, aldosterone. You've already heard me talk about renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. This is the trigger for this. It's a big player. Glucose. And so when someone says they're on steroids, I mean, heck, when I told you about being in a dose pack, that's not a mineralocorticoid or a gonadocorticoid. That is a glucocorticoid. If someone has a bad arthritic knee, if your grandma or your grandpa has an arthritic knee and gets a steroid injection, or you see somebody getting shot up as a football player so they can play, it's a glucocorticoid. There is a certain amount of overlap, particularly in the mineralo and glucose. So we do see fluid retention because when you increase sodium, okay, you'll hear me say this again and again. Sodium and water have a very interesting relationship. When you have sodium, water is drawn to it. I call it Stein's. You'll love this. Mary had a little lamb principle. Wherever sodium goes, water is sure to follow. Right?
Yeah.
Lamb, Mary,
Yeah.
wherever she went, they went. You know what Mary said to the sheep? Let's get the flock out of here. Just saying. There's a really good show on that. Oh my God, it's great. I might even be better than Yellowstone. 1923 is great. It's just with Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. We don't know that yet. That's negotiation tactics. I need more money, and I don't want to be on the team less time, huh?
It's McConaughey.
I mean, he kind of fits that. Costner's a little more iconic in that regard.
I don't know. True Detective season 1.
Yeah, that was as good as it gets. I'll buy it. I'll buy that's as good as it gets.
That performance is better than anything Costner's ever put on film, in my opinion.
It might be.
I think it is.
It's not Waterworld, but what is?
Closest thing probably Dances with Wolves, in my opinion, but I don't think it comes close to McConaughey and True Detective.
That was a great show.
Incredible.
And the bad guys even better.
I heard he's on Broadway Empire.
He's on Boardwalk Empire. Glenn Fleischer is his name, and he has played so many interesting roles in that wonderful show that ran for 3 seasons. It only had like 13 episodes apiece. Hannibal, which was dealing with sort of a multitude of plot lines from that. He played the one guy who basically ate his face because Hannibal gave him stuff for and he played the doctor who was trying to take care of him. Oh, he's just great. Glenn Fleischer. Okay. Moving on. So here's what it looks like. When you get down here, you're in the medulla. So you can see, other than the external capsule, it's very similar, and that's why I don't go crazy with it. They've drawn it schematically to show subtle differences in, let's say, the cellular architecture. That's there. We'll start here with the mineralocorticoid contingent. I like that. Okay. Mineral regulate electrolyte concentrations, sodium and potassium. And if sodium is going in one direction, potassium is generally going in the opposite direction, as we've seen countless examples of, right? So if sodium is going in water is following, potassium is probably going in another direction. Importance, obviously, extracellular fluid, volume, blood pressure, levels of other ions associated with it. Okay, whether it's potassium, hydrogen, bicarb, chloride, obviously a significant role in the resting membrane potential. The secretion is principally aldosterone. Okay, the most potent by far of any of the ones. So it's classically, you saw before with antidiuretic hormone, in the same area, it inserts in what's called the distal convoluted tubule and what they lead into the collecting ducts. It inserts openings that trigger the reabsorption of sodium, and again, water follows. Blood volume and blood pressure. So it's the principal regulator from an endocrine standpoint of our blood pressure. Most of our blood pressure, as you'll come to know, is auto-regulated. As long as your blood pressure is in a reasonable zone, you basically regulate it without having to bring a whole lot of chemicals to the party, other than in extremes. And so, as you can see, when sodium comes in, potassium goes out. The mineralows, effects of aldosterone, short-lived. Activation of sodium potassium pumps exchange sodium for potassium, as they always do. The factors that regulate it. This is the big player, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism we're going to delve into at length. Concentrations of K, potassium, ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex. Okay, and sort of the anti-aldosterone is an interesting chemical called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. Natri means sodium. We don't have a lot of things that make us excrete sodium. This is one of them. And typically what happens, and we'll get to it, when the atria are stretched, it means there's excessive fluid in the system. So what they do, they respond by releasing this that works on the kidneys to get rid of a certain amount of excessive sodium, if you want to think of it that way. So natri, later, I'll see you. Have fun storming the castle. Have fun storming the castle. Natriuretic peptide. So here's the mechanism. Decrease blood pressure, special cells in the kidney. These cells, and those are those, again, those juxtaglomerular cells. Remember that apparatus? We looked at in anatomy. We're going to look at it again because you need to reinforce it again. Renin, okay, with one N, not two. Renin is something in babies. Help them digest milk. Renin cleaves off a particular, and this is a protein that's made called angiotensinogen. Get used to seeing this terminology. Ogen is an inactive precursor. When you digest proteins to start in your gut, starting in your stomach, you make pepsinogen. Hydrochloric acid activates it to pepsin. We use inactive precursors because that way we can control when we need them to be active. And so renin basically chops off a piece to trigger this, resulting eventually in a conversion to angiotensinogen 2. And angiotensin tents the blood vessels. Okay. What it does is, interestingly enough, mostly it stimulates aldosterone, but it also, you do this when you have to retain fluid. So how do we do that? We want to elevate the blood pressure and retain fluid. So it does 4 actions. One, tenses the blood vessels. Another one releases aldosterone to bring back sodium into the party, followed by water. The other 2 make you thirsty, okay, and increases the release of antidiuretic hormone. Anything. So you just think of it in the context of increasing blood pressure by increasing the amount of fluid. It's somewhat logical in that regard. So those 4 actions you should know down the road of angiotensin and the angiotensinogen 2. That's a common way that we modify blood pressure. People with high blood pressure, we interact with the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. One of the medicines that I take called Cozar, generically known as losartan, does that. I mean, it's been around for forever. My mom took it. Okay. Increased potassium directly influences those cells to reduce aldosterone. Increased potassium directly stimulates aldosterone release. Low levels inhibit it. So it responds to potassium levels. Okay. So if the potassium is high, we've got to find a means to get rid of it. ACTH increases in aldosterone for period, and that's what really is a stress response. I remember telling my dad used to get shots, and it was like in those days they didn't have a lot of ways to ramp things up. That was one of the ways they did. In general, it sort of kind of made things feel better. He had blood pressure issues, and the ANP secreted by the heart blocks renin and aldosterone secretion to decrease blood pressure. And here you can show you the factors with that table. Typically, excessive amounts are adrenal tumors. What would happen? High blood pressure. When you have excessive fluid, it increases the hydrostatic or the fluid pressure. And what it does is it overcomes something that we're going to deal with, the colloidal osmotic pressure. So it pushes fluid out of the blood. It's in where they're abundant, and it's associated with excessive amount, typically capillaries. Where do we see this? Gravity, extremities. Most of the time we call it peripheral edema. And again, it's another tell. It's one of the first things, 63 things you look at as a physician. When somebody has heart problems or lung problem, you start squeezing around their ankles to see if they demonstrate a thing called edema. And then if we know if it's mostly fluid, it does a phenomenon called pitting. So when you can push your finger into it, your thumb, over a bony prominence like a medial malleolus typically, and you remove it, it'll leave an indentation. How long it takes for that indentation to fill with fluid is the grading of that particular problem. I mean, I've seen them so bad, you can go out, have a sandwich, come back, and still see the indentation. It's kind of like my car sometimes filling with gas. Ding, ding, ding. I'll be back in half an hour. Ding, ding. Glucocorticoids. Again, a lot of stress-related things are part of this. This is a classic one. So they have their impact is not, and again, when we make medications, there always overlap between mineralo and glucose. So that's why some people will retain fluid when they're taking a dose pack, let's say for poison ivy or an allergic response. So influences metabolism of most cells to help us resist stressors, keeps blood glucose levels relatively constant, helps with blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors. There are several. The most active form that we see in significant amounts is cortisol. Yes, there are others. And we basically, in a pharmacological sense, tinker with those. Like a dose pack of something called methylprednisolone. Something that people take a lot of is prednisone. That was originally one of the limited treatments we had for autoimmune diseases until this whole world of biologicals that we're going to touch on that target certain immunological factors. And I'm on one of those too. It's like me. Or as my wife calls them, all those poisons you're taking. She has my best interest at heart. So let me see. Oh, we're almost done. Hold on. So response to ACTH, corticotropin releasing hormone is its fancy name. Low levels of cortisols in your bloodstream. And again, this is monitored. There's certain daily rhythms. This is what I was talking about before. Why typically in the morning we see these being released. That's why when we discontinue steroids, we tend to discontinue in the morning. So increasing levels inhibit that through negative feedbacks. So there's patterns of activity. And depends if you're a morning person or if you're on night shift. I mean, that'll reverse over time that are there. All of these things can interfere with it. Central nervous system can override it when necessary. Think about things like fight or flight. I don't want to give it short shifts, so we're going to start. We'll start with this on Friday. We surely will get through all of these and start the blood unit. Thank you. I don't see you guys again today, do I? No.